Hello, it's great to have you here. If you enjoy thrilling romances, please like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single story. The Arizona sun of 1888 was not a benevolent creator. It was a hammer, beating down on the anvil of the earth with relentless, shimmering force. It bleached the life from the sky, cracked the soil into a mosaic of thirst, and baked the very air until it felt like breathing in dust. For William, this hammer was simply a fact of life, as immutable as the grief that had taken root in his heart 4 years prior. He rode his steady buckskin, dusty and sweat-stained, his gaze sweeping the horizon. The brim of his hat cast a sliver of shadow across a face carved by hardship, his eyes the color of a faded blue sky, constantly squinting against the glare. He was tracking 3 steers that had broken from the herd, their tracks faint but discernible to a man who spoke the language of the land. It was a lonely conversation. Loneliness was his constant companion, a silent partner in the running of his ranch. It sat with him at his supper table, a single plate and cup. It lay beside him in the cold bed that he and his late wife, Marion, had once shared. He had built a fortress of silence around himself after she was taken by the fever, each day another stone added to the wall. Now, the silence was so complete, he sometimes wondered if his own voice still worked. His horse, Apollo, snorted, shaking its head as if to dislodge the oppressive heat. William reached forward and patted the animal's damp neck. "I know, boy. Just a little further." The words were a rusty croak, unfamiliar in his own throat. He was scanning the base of a series of red rock mesas when he saw them. Not the steers, vultures. They circled high above, dark specks gliding on the thermal currents in a patient, ominous ballet. A cold knot tightened in William's gut. Vultures meant death or something close to it. He nudged Apollo into a steady trot, his hand instinctively resting on the stock of the Winchester rifle in its scabbard. Caution was another lesson the desert taught without mercy. As he drew closer, the scene below the circling birds resolved into something that made him pull Apollo to an abrupt halt. It wasn't a dead coyote or a lost calf. It was a splash of color against the burnt ochre of the ground, the deep turquoise of a beadwork bracelet, the faded red of a woven sash. 3 figures, small and still, lay clustered near the scant shade of a withered mesquite tree. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the hot sand, the rifle now held loosely in his hand. They were girls. Apache girls, he realized, his eyes taking in their fringed buckskin dresses and the long black hair fanned out in the dust. They couldn't be much older than 16 or 17. Their lips were cracked and black, their skin drawn tight over their cheekbones. They were so still, so utterly defeated by the sun, that for a moment he thought he was too late. He knelt beside the nearest one, a girl with a delicate, heart-shaped face. There was no visible wound on any of them, no sign of a struggle, just abandonment, left to the sun and the vultures. A cold, calculated cruelty. He uncorked his canteen and pressed it to her lips, but the water only trickled down her chin. Her eyes didn't even flicker. He moved to the second girl, whose hand was still clenched around a small, empty water skin. Same result. A profound sense of helplessness washed over him, a feeling he hadn't experienced so acutely since he'd watched the light fade from Marion's eyes. Then he saw the third girl. She lay slightly apart from the others, and as he approached, her eyelids fluttered. He knelt, and for a heartbeat her eyes, dark, deep and rimmed with dust, met his. There was no plea in them, no surrender. There was a flicker, a last ember of defiance in a dying fire. It was a language he understood better than words. This one was a fighter. Her name, he would later learn, was Maka. The other 2 were Salali and Ayasha, but in that moment, they were just fading lives. The brutal arithmetic of the desert raced through his mind. His canteen was less than half full. Apollo was already weary from a full day's ride and could not carry 2 riders and a dead weight for the long journey back to the ranch. Trying to save them all was a fool's errand. The desert did not reward sentimentality. It punished it. To stay here to try and ferry them one by one would be to sign all their death warrants, including his own. The vultures would have 4 bodies instead of 3. The choice was monstrous, inhumane. It went against every principle his father had ever taught him about decency and duty. But his pragmatism, honed by years of surviving in this unforgiving land, screamed at him. One or none. His gaze shifted between the 3 girls. Who was he to play God? To decide which life was worth more than another? The thought was a physical sickness that rose in his throat. He looked back at the girl whose eyes had met his. Maka, That flicker of fight in her gaze was a hook in his soul. It was the smallest, most fragile sign of life, but it was there. She was still holding on, even if just by a thread. He had to honor that fight. With a heart that felt like a lead weight in his chest, he made his decision. He gently lifted Maka's head. "Here," he murmured, his voice thick. "Drink." Slowly. He tilted the canteen, and this time she swallowed. A small convulsive movement in her throat. She swallowed again, and then again. He let her have a few precious mouthfuls before pulling the canteen away. He couldn't give her too much, too fast. He looked at the other two, Salali and Ayasha, their faces peaceful in a way that was terrifying. Guilt, sharp and venomous, coiled in his stomach. He was leaving them, condemning them. He tore a strip of cloth from a spare shirt in his saddlebag, soaked it with water, and gently wiped their faces, a useless, pathetic gesture of respect. He then took the canteen, now holding less than a pint of water, and placed it on the ground between them, wedged against a rock where they might see it if they woke. It was a lie, a prayer to a deaf god, but it was all he had to give. "I'll be back," he rasped, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He knew it was unlikely. The distance was too great, the sun too powerful. By the time he could return with a wagon and more water, it would be too late. The promise was for himself, a desperate attempt to fend off the crushing weight of what he was doing. Lifting Maka was a struggle. She was light, but a dead weight, her body limp and unresponsive. He managed to heave her over his shoulder and carry her to Apollo, who shifted nervously at the unfamiliar scent and burden. William settled her in the saddle, draping her in front of him, her head lolled back against his chest, her breath a faint, hot whisper against his neck. He wrapped one arm securely around her waist, holding her tight against him, and took up the reins with his free hand. He cast one last look back at the two still figures under the mesquite tree. They were already beginning to blur in the shimmering heat haze. The image burned itself into his memory. Two small forms left behind, a half-empty canteen standing as a monument to his impossible, terrible choice. He turned Apollo towards home, towards life, but felt as though he were riding into a personal hell. The sun beat down, the vultures continued their patient circling, and the silence of the desert was now filled with the screams of his own conscience. He had saved one, but in doing so, he feared he had just damned himself. The journey back to the ranch was a blur of shimmering heat and the dead weight of the girl in his arms. William rode with a grim determination, the image of the two abandoned figures seared into his mind. Each hoofbeat of Apollo was a drumbeat, counting down the seconds he had stolen for this one life. When the familiar lines of his homestead, the sturdy cabin, the weathered barn, the neat corral finally rose from the heat haze, a wave of exhaustion washed over him so profound it was almost dizzying. He carried Maka inside, her body feeling as fragile as a bird's. The cool, dim interior of the cabin was a shock after the relentless sun. He laid her gently on his own bed, the one that had felt so empty for 4 long years. For a moment, he just stood there, looking down at her. Her face, even coated in dust and grime, had a fierce kind of beauty. Her chest rose and fell in a shallow, uneven rhythm. She was alive. That was all that mattered right now. For the next 2 days, William became a reluctant nurse. He cleaned the dirt from her skin with a damp cloth, his touch awkward and clinical. He spooned water and later thin broth between her cracked lips. He sat by her bedside through the long, quiet nights, listening to her fevered murmurs in a language he didn't understand, the sound a stark reminder of the chasm between their worlds. During these vigils, his own loneliness was a palpable presence in the room. He found himself talking to her, or perhaps just to himself, his voice a low rumble. He spoke of the ranch, of the cattle, of the weather, safe, solid things that couldn't hurt him. On the 3rd day, her fever broke. He walked in from the barn to find her awake, her dark eyes following his every move. They were no longer dull with exhaustion, but sharp and wary, like a cornered wolf. When he approached with a bowl of broth, she flinched, pushing herself up against the headboard. "Easy now," he said softly, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. "It's just food, to make you strong." She stared at him, uncomprehending. He set the bowl on the small table beside the bed and backed away, giving her space. He watched as her gaze darted around the room, taking in the simple wooden furniture, the neatly patched quilt on the bed, the framed photograph of Marion on the mantelpiece, a smiling woman with kind eyes. Her gaze lingered on the photograph before returning to him, a question in their depths. The distrust was a wall between them, thick and high, To her, he was a captor, a white man, an enemy by definition. To him, she was a responsibility he hadn't asked for, a living, breathing symbol of the terrible choice he'd made in the desert. He had to go to town for supplies. The thought filled him with dread. News traveled fast in a place like Harmony Creek, and his arrival with a half-dead Apache girl would not go unnoticed. He left Maka with a pitcher of water and a plate of jerky and bread, locking the cabin door behind him, more for her protection, he told himself, than to keep her a prisoner. The town was just as he expected. The moment he tied Apollo to the hitching post outside the general store, he could feel the eyes on him. Whispers followed him like his own shadow. It was Chester who approached him first. A portly man with a florid face and eyes that were too close together. Chester owned the neighboring ranch and had been trying to buy William out for years, hungry for his access to the only reliable creek in the area. "William," Chester boomed, his voice oozing false bonhomie, "heard you had some excitement out at your place. Found something in the desert, did we?" "I found someone who needed help, Chester," William said, his voice flat. Chester chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. "Help? That's what you call it? I hear it's one of them, an Apache. You know how folks are feeling about Apaches these days, with the trouble up north. It's not safe, William, for you or for the town." The sheriffs already heard whispers. The threat was veiled but clear. Chester was fanning the flames, turning William's act of mercy into an act of treason. "She's just a girl, and she was dying," William said, his jaw tight. "A dying snake can still bite," Chester retorted, his smile vanishing. "You get her off your land, for everyone's sake." He clapped William on the shoulder, a gesture of dominance, before sauntering off toward the saloon, no doubt to spread more poison. William finished his business quickly, the weight of the town's suspicion heavy on his shoulders. He returned to the ranch with a knot of anger and anxiety in his stomach. He expected to find Maka cowering in the corner, but the scene that greeted him was different. She was on her feet, unsteady but resolute. The food he'd left was gone, the plate and cup neatly stacked. She had explored the small cabin, and as he entered, she was standing before the mantelpiece, looking at the photograph of Marion. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. She pointed to the photograph, then tapped her own chest. "A simple question. Who is she to you?" "My wife," William said, his voice catching. "Marion." He pointed to himself. "William." He then pointed to her. A long moment passed. "Maka," she whispered, her voice raspy from disuse. It was the first word she had spoken. A fragile truce began to form in the days that followed. They communicated in a clumsy language of gestures and single words. He saw her watching him from the porch as he worked with Apollo in the corral, his quiet commands and gentle hands belying his rugged exterior. One afternoon she walked out to the small vegetable garden Marion had planted and began with an innate, practiced skill to pull the weeds that he had let grow. She worked with a reverence for the earth that he recognized in himself. She was seeing the man, not the white face, and he was seeing a resilient, intelligent woman, not a savage. But the promise he had made in the desert gnawed at him. He had to know what became of the other two girls. One morning he packed his saddlebags with 2 full canteens and supplies for a day's ride. He tried to explain to Maka with gestures, pointing to the east, making a riding motion, then pointing back to the ranch. "I'm going, but I'll return." Her eyes clouded with a flicker of the old fear, abandonment, but she simply nodded, her gaze holding his for a long moment before she turned and went back inside the cabin. It was a leap of faith for both of them. The ride back to the desolate spot was a pilgrimage of guilt. He found the place easily, the withered mesquite tree a grim landmark. The canteen he had left was gone. He dismounted, his heart pounding, and examined the ground. His own boot prints and Apollo's tracks were there, but they were overlaid with new signs, moccasin prints, smaller and more numerous, the faint drag marks of a travois used to carry the weak. Her people had found them. Salali and Ayasha were alive. The relief that flooded him was so immense, his knees nearly buckled. He sank to the ground, the desert sun beating down on him, and for the first time since Marion's death he let out a shuddering breath that felt like a release. They were alive. He hadn't condemned them. His choice had been cruel, but it hadn't been a death sentence. When he returned to the ranch as dusk painted the sky in shades of purple and orange, a thin curl of smoke was rising from the cabin's chimney. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth, chasing away the evening chill. Maka sat before it, mending a tear in one of his work shirts with a needle and thread she must have found in Marion's old sewing box. She looked up as he entered, her eyes asking the question she could not speak. He simply nodded, a small, weary smile touching his lips for the first time in years. "They're safe," he said, knowing she wouldn't understand the words, but hoping she would understand the peace in his voice. She held his gaze, and in the warm firelight the wall between them seemed to crumble just a little bit more. The peace that settled over William's ranch was as fragile and beautiful as a desert flower after a rare rain. It was a peace built not on words, but on shared silence and mutual respect. He learned the rhythm of Maka's day. She rose with the sun, her movements quiet and purposeful. She tended the small garden with an expert's touch, coaxing life from the stubborn soil. She would watch him work the cattle, her dark eyes observant, missing nothing. In turn, he learned her habits, the way she tilted her head when a hawk cried, the soft humming sound she made while grinding corn he'd bought in town, the fierce pride that kept her from accepting any help she didn't absolutely need. One afternoon he was mending a corral fence while she sat on the porch steps, methodically stripping the thorns from a yucca stalk. He held up a hammer. "Hammer," he said, tapping the tool. She looked from the hammer to his face, her expression serious. "Hammer," she repeated, the word an unfamiliar shape in her mouth, but clear. She then held up the sharp stone tool she was using. "Tesu," she said, her voice soft but firm. He smiled, a genuine, unforced smile that reached his eyes. "Tesu." He tested the word, liking the feel of it. He was beginning to understand that this was not just teaching. It was an exchange. A bridge being built, one plank at a time, across a silent river. For the first time in 4 years, the fortress of his solitude felt less like a refuge and more like a prison from which he was slowly being freed. The peace was shattered by a shadow. It fell over him suddenly, blocking the afternoon sun. He looked up from his work, his hand freezing on the fence post. A man stood there, not 10 feet away. He had appeared from nowhere, as silent as a ghost. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his skin the color of burnished copper. He wore buckskin leggings and a breechcloth, his chest bare and marked with faded battle scars. A long bow was slung over his shoulder, and a knife with a handle of antler bone was sheathed at his hip. His black hair was held back by a simple leather band, and his face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. His eyes, dark and piercing, were fixed not on William, but on Maka. Maka rose slowly to her feet, the yucca stalk forgotten on the ground. "Tokala," she breathed, the name a mixture of shock and something else William couldn't decipher. The warrior Tokala spoke to her in the Apache tongue. His voice was a low, dangerous growl. William didn't need to understand the words to comprehend the meaning. It was an accusation, a demand. "What are you doing here with this man?" William straightened up slowly, moving deliberately to place himself between Tokala and the porch, his body a shield for Maka. He didn't reach for the pistol on his hip, knowing that any sudden move would be a fatal mistake. "She's safe here," he said, his voice level and calm, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. Tokala's gaze snapped to William, dismissing him as one might an insect. He barked another command at Maka, gesturing for her to come to him. She hesitated, her eyes darting between the two men. She saw the coiled spring tension in Tokala, a warrior she had known her whole life, the man she was promised to, and she saw the quiet, unyielding resolve in William, the man who had chosen to save her. Her world was balanced on a knife's edge. "Maka, go to him," William said softly, not taking his eyes off Tokala. "It's all right." But she didn't move. Instead, she took a step forward and did the one thing neither man expected. She moved to stand beside William, facing Tokala. Her small frame seemed to draw strength from the earth itself. She began to speak, her voice clear and strong, the melodic, rapid-fire words of her people filling the air. William stood frozen, listening to the story he couldn't understand but knew was his own. He watched Tokala's face as Maka spoke. The warrior's stony expression began to crack. The raw fury in his eyes was replaced by confusion, then by a dawning, reluctant comprehension. Maka's hands moved as she spoke, painting a picture in the air. The merciless sun, the thirst, 3 falling figures, a lone rider, a canteen. She pointed to William, then pressed her hand to her heart. She spoke of his care, of the broth, of the quiet respect he had shown her. She finished by pointing to the east, recounting William's journey to find her companions. When she fell silent, the yard was thick with tension. Tokala's gaze moved from Maka to William, truly seeing him for the first time. The judgment in his eyes was still there, but it was now tempered with a sliver of doubt. He spoke again, his tone less harsh, directed at Maka, but clearly for William's benefit as well. He confirmed what William already knew. A hunting party had found the tracks and rescued Salali and Ayasha. They were weak, but they would live. A breath William hadn't realized he was holding escaped his lips. But then Tokala's expression hardened again. He explained that the story the girls told, of being left to die by a white man, had spread through the tribe like a plague. The act, no matter the reason, was seen as the ultimate cruelty. Their chief had declared that the fragile peace with the settlers was over. Every rancher, every prospector in the territory was now considered an enemy. William's act of saving one life had inadvertently endangered every white person for 100 miles. The weight of that revelation settled heavily on William. His choice in the desert had thrown a stone into a still pond, and the ripples were now turning into a tidal wave. Meanwhile, in Harmony Creek, Chester was holding court in the dusty confines of the saloon. A nervous-looking rider, having spotted the imposing Apache warrior at William's ranch from a distant ridge, had galloped into town with the news. Chester seized upon it like a starving dog on a bone. "He's got a warrior out there," Chester bellowed, slamming his mug of beer on the bar for emphasis. The dozen or so patrons, ranch hands, miners, and aimless drifters, fell silent. "I warned him. I told you all he was harboring a savage. Now he's brought a whole buck to his doorstep. They're planning something, I tell you." A man in the corner nervously cleared his throat. "Now, Chester, William is a quiet man. He keeps to himself." "Keeps to himself?" Chester laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "He's sitting on the best water source in this county, while the rest of us pray for rain. And now he's making treaties with the very people who'd like to see us all scalped. He's in league with them, I say. He's trading our safety for his own." Fear, potent and irrational, began to poison the air in the room. Chester saw it and pressed his advantage, his eyes glittering with greed. This was his chance. He could eliminate his rival, seize the land he'd always coveted, and be hailed as a hero for doing it. "We can't wait for the sheriff to write a letter to the cavalry," he declared, his voice rising with theatrical fervor. "By then, they'll be burning our homes. We have to ride out there. We have to deal with this problem ourselves, for the safety of our women and children." He let the words hang in the air. The men looked at each other, their initial skepticism melting away under the heat of Chester's rhetoric and their own deep-seated fears. The man who had defended William now looked down at his drink, his courage failing him. "Who's with me?" Chester roared, pulling his own pistol from its holster and laying it on the bar. One by one, spurred by a toxic mix of fear, whiskey, and Chester's manipulative lies, the men rose to their feet. They were not soldiers. They were a mob, and they had found their cause. Back at the ranch, an uneasy truce had settled. Tokala had not left, but he kept his distance, a silent, watchful sentinel at the edge of the property. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the clouds in fiery strokes of orange and red. William stood on his porch, the Winchester rifle now resting in the crook of his arm, watching the dust devils dance in the distance. Maka stood beside him, a silent partner in the vigil. The fragile peace was over. The world was coming for them, and as the first plume of dust rose on the horizon, too large for a single rider, too organized for stray cattle, William knew that the battle for his land, for his life, and for the woman standing beside him had just begun. The approaching dust cloud resolved into a posse of angry, determined men, their shouts carrying on the wind like the baying of hounds. There were at least 15 of them, led by Chester, who sat atop a large roan horse, his face flushed with whiskey and self-importance. They were not an army, but a mob, which in some ways was more dangerous. Tokala materialized at William's side, a silent spectre of war. His eyes, fixed on the riders, were chips of obsidian. He held his longbow in one hand, an arrow already nocked in the other. He glanced at William, a question in his gaze that transcended language. "Where do we make our stand?" "The barn," William said, his voice a low command. "The wood is thick. Good cover." He looked at Maka. "Stay in the cabin. Lock the door. Keep your head down." Her eyes flashed with that familiar fire he'd first seen in the desert. She shook her head, her jaw set. She picked up a heavy iron skillet from the porch, its weight a meager but defiant statement. She would not hide while her world was under attack. William saw the futility of arguing. He gave a sharp nod of acceptance. "All right, but stay out of the sightlines from the front." The three of them moved with grim purpose. William took up a position at a hayloft window in the barn, his Winchester resting on the sill. It gave him a clear view of the approaching riders. Tokala melted into the shadows near the corral, the wooden fences providing a maze of cover that would allow him to move and fire from multiple angles. Maka took her place just inside the cabin door, a silent observer, ready to act. It was a desperate, unlikely alliance, a lonely rancher, an Apache warrior, and the woman who now stood between their two worlds. Chester's posse reined in just outside rifle range, a chaotic jumble of men and horses. "William," Chester's voice boomed across the yard, "you've got one chance. Send out the Apache buck and the girl. We have no quarrel with you." It was a lie, and everyone knew it. William's finger tightened on the trigger of his rifle. He remained silent, letting the setting sun cast long, menacing shadows across the yard. His silence was his answer. "Have it your way," Chester roared. "Burn him out." The first volley of shots was wild and inaccurate, kicking up dust and splintering the top rail of the corral fence. They were meant to intimidate, to frighten them into surrender, but they underestimated the resolve of the 3 people defending the ranch. William took a steadying breath, sighted on a man trying to advance toward the cabin, and squeezed the trigger. His shot was not aimed to kill, but to maim. The man screamed and dropped his rifle, clutching a shattered shoulder. He scrambled back toward the others, his courage gone. An arrow hissed from the shadows of the corral. Another of Chester's men, who had dismounted to use his horse for cover, grunted and fell sideways, an arrow buried deep in his thigh. He lay writhing on the ground. Tokala had made his presence known. The attack faltered. The mob was made of bullies and cowards, not seasoned fighters. They had expected a single frightened rancher, not a determined defense from unseen positions. "Spread out," Chester bellowed, his face now a mask of rage. "He can't watch every angle." The battle descended into a tense, deadly game of cat and mouse. William used his knowledge of every dip and swell of his land, his shots precise and deliberate, forcing the attackers to stay pinned down. Tokala was a phantom, moving with impossible speed and silence between the fences and water troughs, his arrows finding their marks with terrifying accuracy. He was not fighting for William or his land. He was fighting with the cold fury of a warrior defending one of his own. Chester, growing more desperate, saw the small garden near the side of the house. It was a blind spot from the barn. He dismounted, motioning for 2 of his cronies to follow him. "We'll set the cabin on fire. Smoke 'em out like rats." He didn't see Maka. She had watched them from the cabin window, her heart pounding. The skillet felt useless in her hands. Her eyes scanned the room and fell on Marion's sewing box. Inside she found a pair of long, sharp shears. They felt cold and solid in her hand. Slipping out the back door, she moved with the innate stealth of her people, using a row of sunflowers as cover until she was hidden behind the rain barrel at the corner of the house. She heard their heavy footsteps, Chester's wheezing breath. "Get the kindling ready," he ordered one of the men. As the man knelt to strike a match against the dry cabin wall, Maka burst from behind the barrel. She moved not like a girl, but like a striking cougar. She drove the point of the shears into the man's arm. He howled in pain and surprise, dropping the match. The second man turned, raising his pistol, but Maka was already moving, kicking his feet out from under him. He fell hard, the pistol flying from his grasp. Chester stared, his jaw slack with disbelief. He fumbled for his own gun, but it was too late. William had seen the commotion from the loft. A single shot from the Winchester kicked Chester's pistol out of his hand, sending it spinning into the dust. The fight was broken. The remaining men, seeing their leader disarmed and their numbers dwindling, lost their nerve completely. They scrambled for their horses and fled, leaving their wounded comrades groaning in the dirt. Silence fell over the ranch, thick and heavy, broken only by the whimpering of the injured men and the tired breathing of the 3 defenders. William came down from the hayloft, his rifle held loosely at his side. Tokala emerged from the shadows, his face grim. They met in the middle of the yard, near where Chester was nursing his stinging hand. Tokala looked at Chester with utter contempt, then turned his gaze to William. He nodded, a gesture of profound, hard-won respect. He then walked to Maka, who stood trembling slightly, the adrenaline of the fight leaving her. He spoke to her softly in their language. William couldn't understand the words, but he could read the story in the warrior's eyes. It was a story of release, of sacrifice. Tokala gently touched her shoulder, a final farewell. He looked at William one last time. "She protected your home," he said, the English words slow and deliberate. "You protected her life, the debt is paid." He turned and walked away, not looking back, his tall figure melting into the twilight until he was gone. He was leaving her to the new life she had chosen, or that had chosen her. William went to Maka, The setting sun bathed them in a soft golden light. He gently took the shears from her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. For a long moment they just stood there, the chaos of the battle fading, leaving only the quiet truth of what had passed between them. The world had tried to tear them apart, and in doing so, had forged them together. "He's gone," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yes," William said. He looked around at the splintered fences and the dust-covered ground. "It's over." He then looked back at her, his gaze holding all the words he had never been able to say. He reached out and gently brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek. "My choice in the desert, I thought it was about saving one life. I was wrong." Maka looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his. What was it about? A slow smile, weary but genuine, touched William's lips. "It was about finding my own." She leaned into his touch, a silent acknowledgement that this place, this man, was now her home. Together, they stood in the settling dust of the battlefield, two survivors from two different worlds, looking out at the vast, quiet landscape. The sun had set, but for the first time in a very long time, neither of them felt like they were facing the darkness alone. True courage isn't found in the absence of impossible choices, but in the compassion we choose to show in the face of them. A single act of mercy, however flawed, can bridge the widest of divides and ultimately heal the deepest wounds, especially those within ourselves. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to confirm your subscription and leave a like. It helps us a lot.